Hello, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Teresa Kaiser, the Director of the Public Library of Anniston-Calhoun County. Today, we are going to be providing a program on it's called Loyalty, Courage, and Valor. It's on the history of the Anniston Fire Department. But before we get to that, let me tell you a little bit about what's going on at the library. As you know, we have been closed due to the COVID and just doing the front walk-up service. Yesterday, we actually opened our doors, so we are inviting you back into the library. There are some rules that we're going to ask you to abide by, and you can read those on Facebook, or you can read them on our website, and we also have them posted at the door. But we hope that you will come back into the library and begin to check out some items. Computers are available for use now. We've also started our summer reading program. This is for the children, the teens, and the adults. Today's program is actually part of our adult summer reading program. And if you sign up for our adult summer reading program online, and there is a link on our website that you'll find, or you can go to publiclibrary.cc/summer reading, and you can get a link there. And you can start posting your books, logging your books for every book or thing that you check out that you log, you get points. The more points you get, if you get 1,500 points, you are eligible for a random drawing for a $100 gift card. If you get up to 3,000 points, you're eligible for a random drawing for a $250 gift card. Today's program is worth 500 points, and you would log that under your missions in your summer reading program. There is a secret code that is required to log it, so I'll be giving that secret code later in the program, so stay tuned after we finish. But to get the program started, we are happy today to welcome David Boyd. He has been with the fire department. He is retired as an assistant chief after 30 years of service. He now teaches for the Fire College, and his interest is in the history of the Anniston Fire Department. He has written a wonderful book. It's called Loyalty, Courage, and Valor, the Story of the Anniston Fire Department. And he's going to talk with us a little bit about it today and tell you how, if you would like a copy, that you can purchase a copy. And we do also have copies here at the library that you can check out. So if you will, please welcome David Boyd to the stand.
Well, thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank Teresa Kaiser and the library for allowing me to be here today. I've never done this before. This is my first book and probably will be my final book, but I'm humbled that anybody has enough interest to tune in and look at this. As already been mentioned, I'm David Boyd. I spent 30 years with the Anniston Fire Department. Retiring as assistant fire chief. I couldn't believe that 30 years went by so fast. I remember the month prior to my retirement, I called the city clerk 3 times to make sure that the mistake hadn't been made, that it actually was 30 years. When I was a little boy, all little boys wanted to grow up and be firefighters. I consider myself blessed that I was able to actually do that. Like anybody else in their career, there's been ups and downs and things of that nature. I was injured 4 times in the line of duty, but I wouldn't trade it for anything. Best job in the world. I mean, in what other job can you exceed the speed limit, go the wrong way down a one-way street, kick in a man's front door, cut a hole in his roof, wash all of his furniture out in the yard, and then when you leave, he shakes your hand, tells you thank you, and they give you a check every 2 weeks. It was just a wonderful job. But when I retired in 2012, number 1 on my bucket list was to put this book together. And it took 8 years from that point to become a published work. But it all actually started in the 1980s, the late 1980s. Lieutenant Jesse Bert and I were standing in the lobby of our number 1 fire station. And we were looking at some pictures of some firefighters from the late 30s. We didn't know a whole lot about those guys. And I remember him saying, you know, if somebody doesn't do something, 50 years from now, somebody's going to be standing right here looking at our pictures, saying the same things about us. And so it was at that point that I began to do research on the fire department. And I researched records, I researched old reports and newspapers, But most importantly, I interviewed older firemen, some family members of older firemen, retirees, and a lot of those people are gone now. In fact, Jesse Burdett that I just mentioned, he passed away last year. That picture that I used for a cover, if we could put the cover up, or the picture that I used for cover, that was always going to be my cover. I don't know why, I just loved it. And the guy on the front there in the foreground, that's Harold Johnson. And Harold retired many years after this picture as a captain. He never knew my plans for the cover. And on the very morning that the book actually came out, Harold passed away. So many people that had a hand in making the Anniston Fire Department what it is today are no longer with us. So this book really is their story. Most people know the history of Calhoun County and Anniston and how it all began. Anniston began because of the rich deposits of iron ore in the area. And so the Tylers and the Nobles, they came and established the Woodstock Iron Company. Samuel Noble didn't want his people to live in the slums that he had seen in other places around industrial areas, so he developed and laid out a model city. And since there was already a Woodstock, Alabama, the city was named for Alfred Tyler's wife, Annie. So Anniston was first born as a closed company town. But on July 3rd, 1883, it was opened to the public, and the first lot was sold to W.H. Williams from Tennessee. And that lot, incidentally, is now what we call the northeast corner of 10th and Noble, so it's not too far from where we're at right now. But sometime later, Dr. J.L. Weichel came to that company town. He started Weichel Drug Store, which was a fixture on Noble Street for years. Dr. Weichel is considered to be the father of fire protection in Anniston. He actually hadn't been a pharmacist. He was a physician, and he had come here from Cartersville, Georgia, hoping to be the company physician for the ironworks. But when he got here, he realized that they already had a company doctor, so he opened a drug store. Dr. Weichel is known as the father of fire protection in Anniston, not because he formed the fire department, but it was because of his education and knowledge of chemicals. That first fire apparatus that they had was a hand-drawn chemical engine. And the way that it worked, into the tank you put water, and then you put bicarbonate of soda, and then you introduce some acid. And the chemical reaction between the acid and the soda built up pressure, and that's what propelled the water through the hose and onto the fire. So Weichel knew how much of each to put in, and so he kept that apparatus ready for its use. In fact, he stored it in a shed right next to his drugstore. It was a little bit later that Dave Goodwin, a bookkeeper at the Anniston Manufacturing Company, which was also a Noble and Tyler enterprise, organized the first volunteer fire company. It was called the Daniel Tyler Hose Company, after General Daniel Tyler. This trumpet, this silver fire trumpet, is from that time period, and it's still on display at the headquarters of the Anniston Fire Department. And what this was used for, this was kind of used like a megaphone. Before radios, before voice amplification, the fire officer would take it, hold it up to his mouth, shout out orders to his men. And so over the years, the fire trumpet has actually become the rank insignia of the fire officer. The more trumpets on the collar, the more advanced the rank. So in 1883, when the city was open to the public, the fire department, as it was already here. By 1888, there were 4 separate fire companies in Anniston, but they were collectively known as the Anniston Fire Department. In addition to the Daniel Tyler Company, there was the Glen Eddy Hose Company, the Anniston City Company, and the West Anniston Hose Company. They were still volunteer primarily, but each had a paid driver, and the city paid them the lofty sum of $480 a year to drive the fire apparatus. The driver of the West Anniston Hose Company, number 4, was a fellow by the name of Daniel Cornelius Rainwater. He had come to Anniston in 1889, and in 1894 he got involved with the fire department. Weichel may be the father of fire protection in Anniston. Dave Goodwin might have organized that first fire company, but undeniably, D.C. Rainwater was the father of the Anniston Fire Department. Rainwater loved his fire horses. This is a picture of his beloved West Anniston Hose Company. That's Chief Rainwater at the reins there with driving the apparatus. And these two horses are probably his most favorite horses, Bill and Mike. And it was said that before they went out on a call, he would give them a pep talk. He taught them tricks to entertain the children. But when the fire bell rang, they were all business. This is a picture of the Glen Eddy Hose Company. It's located at 4th and Pine. The building still stands, but it is in an awful state of repair today. And just behind where the men are standing there in the truck bay, engraved in the floor are the names Lewis and Todd. Now, these weren't firemen's names. These were horses' names. They cared for the horses that much to engrave their names in the floor of the bay. Since I took this picture, some guys from the fire department have taken these names up and restored them, and now they're on display at our new training facility out on Highway 21. At a little after 3 a.m. on March 14th, 1907, one of those drivers, Charles Herron, received the report of a house fire. In those days, fire calls came in to the police station. The warden, who was the only one on duty at the police station, notified Herron of the fire, but he didn't know how to activate the fire alarm so that the other volunteer firemen would know to respond. So Herron, who had already harnessed the horses, he went to the chief of police office to transmit the alarm. When the alarm was transmitted, the doors to the station automatically came open. The horses were ready to go, and they did. Went out into the night. Herron chased them, mounted the rear step, tried to grab for the reins, but before he could, they hit a tree. One of the horses actually fell on him. He had some injuries to his chest, some injuries to his leg, but he recovered. And Chief Cord Allen blamed the accident on communication problems and lack of manpower. Those are still two main problems we see in the fire service today that chiefs complain about. As the first decade of the 20th century drew to a close, America was transitioning from true horsepower to the internal combustion engine. The first motorized vehicle in Anniston's fleet was actually a motorcycle. This was the official city vehicle of Chief Roy P. Smith. And the city allowed Chief Smith $5 a month for upkeep and fuel. In 1911, Anniston took delivery of its first motorized fire apparatus. This is a 1911 Mack. In that same year, Daniel Cornelius Rainwater was elected fire chief of the volunteer department. However, rather than working out of headquarters on Gurney Avenue, he decided that he was going to stay with his beloved West Anniston Hose Company. And he continued to drive the fire apparatus. In not being able to persuade him any other way, the city council passed an ordinance in 1913 designating City Hall as the official office of the fire chief. He complied, and then the next year, 1914, when Anniston became a paid department, he was chosen to continue as fire chief. As time went on, more horses were retired and replaced by motorized fire trucks. Most of the fires that they had back in those days were roof blazes, where embers would come out of the chimney and they would land on the wooden shingles and cause a fire. Rainwater put into place an inspection program. An ordinance was passed requiring all flues to be lined with terracotta. I mean, this was proactive for the day. and it prevented many fires. And even though fires were common back in those days, during that time, Anniston was known as the city that never burns. Even though Anniston was now a paid department, you really couldn't count on a career because each employee of the city had to be elected by the city council each year. This was long before civil service. And that practice was in force up until the late 1930s. Perhaps the most well-known landmark in Anniston in the first part of the 20th century was the Anniston Inn. Supposedly, the Anniston Inn was the first hotel in the United States completely illuminated by electric lights. It was not only a hotel, but it was a meeting place for the community, and it was home for some well-known Anniston residents. The Atlanta Constitution called it a masterpiece of workmanship and art. It boasted a fine restaurant. Well-known people dined there. One of those was General John J. Blackjack Pershing, who led American forces during the First World War. He ate there whenever he visited Camp McClellan. His favorite dish there is said to have been opossum. Early in the morning of January 3rd, 1923, a guest who had to catch an early train notified the night clerk of a fire on the 4th floor. The fire was devastating because, as you can see from the picture, the inn was made almost completely of wood. What you can't see on the left side is the kitchen area. It was a 2-story brick building where the kitchen was and the servants stayed and things of that nature. And it was made completely of brick, while most of the rest of the Anniston Inn was made of wood. It's a rare picture of it burning in 1923. Firefighters from Anniston, Jacksonville, Camp McClellan, and Piedmont assisted, but the inn was a total loss except for that kitchen. That kitchen still stands today, in fact. It's the only thing that stands on that 5 acres. And most recently, that kitchen was an event venue, a very nice place where weddings were done and things like that. An interesting note, one of the residents of the Anniston Inn was Miss Iva Cook. Now, Miss Iva Cook was the society editor of the Anniston Star. And she lived there, she found herself homeless, so she decided that she would move a few blocks downtown to the Alabama Hotel. A little later, she would find herself homeless again because of a fire there, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Just before the Depression hit, Anniston built a new fire station to protect South Anniston, or as most people called it in those days, Oksana. Station 2 was built at the corner of F Street and Wilmer Avenue, and at one time the 2nd floor was actually a branch of the Anniston Library. It joined Station 1 near City Hall, and Station 3, which was just diagonally across the street from where we are right now in what is now Couch's parking lot. That's where Station 3 was. This is a picture of Station 3, and it also served at the time as headquarters. Now, if you look closely at the picture, you notice there's a little girl peering out of the bedroom upstairs. That was Chief Rainwater's granddaughter. Now, Chief Rainwater is the guy in the car there that's on the passenger side. That was his granddaughter. She wanted to get into the picture with all the firemen. He told her that she couldn't, and told her finally, she pitched a fit, told her to go inside the station. She did, and went upstairs and got in the picture anyway. On January 15th, 1931, a carrier for the Anniston Star noticed flames showing from the southeast corner of the roof of the Calhoun County Courthouse. He notified the sheriff's office. Shortly, Chief Rainwater and all 13 of his department began to attack the fire. Chief Rainwater knew that the only way to have a chance to save it was to have an interior attack. Still, many lessons or records were lost, but because of their efforts, many were saved. The courthouse itself was pretty much gutted. local politicians called for an inquiry. The city council began an investigation, as did other organizations. And when it was all over, it was determined that no blame at all should be attached to Chief Rainwater or his men. In fact, the state commended them for saving as much as they did. But a year and a half later, when a new mayor took over, Chief D.C. Rainwater, for the first time since 1894, was no longer a member of the Anniston Fire Department. Many of his men weren't reappointed either. And even though that the reason was not officially given, I think it probably all had to do with the courthouse fire. Taking Rainwater's place as fire chief was Emmett Elskin Mays. Now, for many years, Chief Mays was a mystery to the fire department. We didn't have a picture. All we knew that he was fire chief for 4 years. We did find out that prior to his appointment as fire chief, he had been a driver for the Calhoun County Creamery. And so we just assumed that he was an appointee, just a political appointee. And I was at church talking to one of the older ladies there about this, because I spent a lot of time researching this, trying to find something. And she said, well, you know his granddaughter goes to church here, don't you? And I said, no. And we began to talk about that. A lot of things I got from her, the picture being one of them. And she sent me down some other alleys that I could investigate. And I found out that Chief Mays was not just an appointee. During the First World War, he was a veteran of the First World War. He had been trained as a firefighter by the military, and he was experienced at it. In fact, after his 4 years in Anniston was over with, he went on to what was then Anniston Ordnance Depot and was a firefighter there and retired there as chief. Taking his place was Emmett E. Mays. Emmett E. White. Chief White would be chief for 24 years. My dad remembered Chief White walking around town in a full dress uniform all the time. In the late 30s, a move was made by the city that had an effect that I think probably surprised them. Back in 1931, the state legislature had enacted legislation that required any city with a population of between 20 and 50,000 that operated under a commission form of government to have a civil service system. Since its incorporation, Anniston had been under a mayor-council form. But in 1939, a commission form of government was adopted by the city, and Anniston immediately fell under that act. Any employee at that time that had worked for the city 1 month or longer was now a permanent city employee. So that policy they had of appointing the city employees every year was no more. Almost immediately, the work schedule of the Anniston firemen changed. It was popular in that time, the 24-hour on-duty, 24-hour off-duty schedule, so they adopted that. Prior to that, Anniston firemen got 1 day off a month. Other than that, they just stayed at the station. Also that year, the Anniston Policemen and Firemen's Retirement Fund was born, and I'm sure glad that it was. It's been amended several times since then, and of course, you probably heard in this past year or so how the Anniston Policemen and Firemen's Retirement Fund was destined to go bankrupt. I've been to the meetings. I'm here to tell you it's not. Also that year, the 40s, the next year brought about the years of World War II. But for Anniston, it was also a decade of some tragic fires. If you travel up Noble Street right now, when you get to the northwest corner of 12th and Noble, there's a big hole in the ground. Plans are to put a hotel there. What a lot of people don't realize is that that was one time the site of a hotel. It was the site of the Alabama Hotel. The 4-story, 94-room hotel had stood on that corner since 1902. It was home to not only travelers, but also housed permanent residents. Many shops and businesses were located there. In the early morning of September 15th, 1944, a fire broke out in the Gem Beauty Shop, which was located on the first floor. it moved up rapidly, and the police began evacuating the 200 guests and residents that were there. Firefighters soon joined them in that. To escape the flames, one of the residents, or one of the guests, William Hornbuckle, tied an American flag and some bed sheets together and attempted to crawl out and escape by crawling down the face of the building. The rope broke, he fell, and was transported to the hospital but died there. 4 days later, the body of a 17-year-old soldier's wife from Fort McClellan was found in the area that you can see that's collapsed, that in the lobby area there. And she was identified by her husband and father by a bracelet that she had worn. A lot of people talk about the Alabama Hotel and that so many people died there, but the death toll, fortunately, was only 2. There were also some injuries, including a 28-year-old woman who jumped from an upper floor into a life net. And a life net, if you've seen a life net, it looks like a trampoline. Firemen hold it and people jump into it. The trouble with a life net is the only people that are trained to jump in them are firemen. And so usually if people jump in them, they're going to be injured as well as the fireman holding it. And that was the case with her. She suffered a broken hip. Some of those that were led to safety were led by Miss Iva Cook. Remember her? She was displaced in 1923 when the Anniston Inn burned. And so then she moved to the Alabama Hotel, and now she found herself homeless again. I've often wondered, after this was over with, if she just gave up living in hotels and decided to buy her a house. I don't know. The next year, there was a major fire just across the street, just across 12th Street. When I was a kid, the southwest corner of 12th and Noble was a vacant lot. And right in the middle of that vacant lot was what was left of an old bank vault. And the reason for that is because the Commercial National Bank once stood there. Just after 1 a.m. on Christmas Day, 1945, firefighters responded to a fire there. Now, due to the hour of the day and the type of business, no evacuation was necessary, so they could immediately start fighting the fire. In the alley behind what you see there, Fireman Gus Waters, Chief White, and Captain Bert Cole were there. The rear wall collapsed. White and Waters were able to escape, but Captain Cole was partially buried and probably died instantly, becoming the first Anniston firefighter to be killed in the line of duty. He was a 27-year veteran of the department. In fact, he was the senior man on the department. He had more years on the job than even Chief White. Ironically, the week before, in a discussion at the fire station, they were talking about how long he had been on, and he said, well, if something ever happens to me, I'd like for my body to be carried to the cemetery on the back of a fire truck. On December 27th, that request was granted. An interesting note here is for the remainder of his career, Chief White carried Captain Cole's helmet in the back of his fire car. 8 years later, November 2nd, 1953, 2 Anniston firefighters took the city's ladder truck to the 1100 block of Noble Street, and they began to hang a banner across Noble Street from one side to the other that said, "Vote November 17th." The truck was parked in the street, traffic was routed around the truck, and a truck from Anniston Ordnance Depot, which we know now is AAD, an ammunition truck was coming up Noble Street and actually hit the ladder truck, causing the ladder to fall. One of the men, Horace Holland, who later became fire chief, was able to grab a rope and swing over to a ledge over a cafe. I think it was the Sanitary Cafe. The other firefighter, Frank Walters, went down with the ladder and struck both a parked car and the pavement, and he died 6 days later without regaining consciousness. I talked with firefighter Walters' daughter several years ago, And she said that at the time of the incident, her father was actually working out a 2-week notice. He had resigned from the department. And on the day that the incident happened, that wasn't his shift. He was actually working for another firefighter. Toward the end of the 1950s, the city purchased a new truck for the department. It was a GMC. And what made this truck so special was that this was the first one that they had had with an enclosed cab. Up to this point, everything had an open cab. And whenever before that the idea of buying an enclosed cab was mentioned, the city always said, firemen aren't supposed to be comfortable. So they didn't do it. In 1957, that truck was dispatched on a call, and it crested 10th Street Mountain. And as it was coming over 10th Street Mountain, it began to slide. It left the road, went off the road, turned completely over. The fireman that was on the tailboard or the rear step, he was thrown and it broke a rib, but the 2 firefighters that were in the cab of the truck survived with just cuts and bruises. Chief White credited their survival to that enclosed cab. By the way, it'd be the mid-1980s until the dangerous practice of riding the tailboard would be outlawed. I was one of the last 3 Anniston firefighters to ever be stationed on the tailboard, riding the tailboard. The 1960s was a busy time for the Anniston Fire Department. First, there was a change in command. Chief Emmett White, which had been at the helm since 1936, reached his 60th birthday. And according to the Retirement Act, mandatory retirement was at 60, so he had to retire. Assuming command was Chief James Ballard. Soon after, Anniston was thrown into the national spotlight. The civil rights movement was in full swing, and a group of people known as the Freedom Riders were traveling by bus through the South to test the laws of Southern segregation. On May 4th, 1961, when they pulled into the Greyhound bus station in Anniston, they were met by an angry mob. They shouted insults at them, they shattered some windows, apparently slashed some tires, and by the time they got to Forsyth's Grocery, just west of town, the bus could go no further. A firebomb was tossed inside, igniting the bus. The mob held the door shut, and had it not been for a state trooper who was on scene and fired a warning shot, I think the outcome could have been fatal. Early in my career, I worked with a couple of guys that responded to that, and they told me that as they went, they got on top of John Hardy Hill, which overlooks the scene, and as they looked at it, they knew how volatile things were in the South at the time. And they didn't know what to expect when they got down there. But they went down there and they did their duty. During the 1960s, Anniston firemen responded to many instances such as fire bombings. They were even fired upon by snipers. But they always did their duty. Anniston has and does assist other departments when called upon. It's called mutual aid. And it was a mutual aid call that resulted in the death of the 3rd Anniston firefighter to be killed in the line of duty. On the evening of April 6, 1967, a truck with 2 men on board was sent to assist at a fire involving the birthplace of Confederate Major John Pelham in Alexandria. Sometime around 10:30 p.m., the truck needed to be moved, but the brakes had locked. It was a quirk with this particular truck that sometimes the brakes would lock, and to unlock them, somebody had to climb underneath it with some pliers and release the brakes. And that night, rookie firefighter Jimmy Walker went under the truck, and when he released the brakes, which he had probably done many times before, suddenly the truck lurched back over him, and he died on the scene. There were some good things about the 60s. The fire department did get its own radio system. 3 new stations were open. That 24 on duty, 48 off duty was no more, and they started the 24-hour on duty, or 24-hour on duty, 24-hour off duty was done away with, and they went to 24 hours on duty, 48 off duty. But as a now retired firefighter that was there said about that decade, Those were troubled times. That's Anniston Foundry. My wife likes that picture, so I thought I would include that. I mentioned the practice of riding the tailboard or rear step of the fire truck. It was a very dangerous practice. Case in point was an accident that occurred March 26, 1970. Rookie firefighter Jimmy Henderson was on the back of the fire truck. They were en route to a fire on West 18th Street. Somewhere along the way, Henderson fell off. He was injured, but he had the presence of mind to crawl under a car, a parked car. When the fire truck got there, they didn't know he had fallen off. They just knew he wasn't there. A citizen had seen it happen. They notified the police. The police found him. He was transported to the hospital, but his injuries kept him in a body cast for several months, and it was about a year before he could come back to work. Chief Ballard reached his 60th birthday in 1973, which required him to retire, and taking his place was Chief Horace Holland. He was a 22-year veteran of the department at the time. I wish I had a better picture of Chief Holland. One of the first major equipment upgrades under Chief Holland was the purchase of another piece of aerial apparatus. Now, aerial apparatus is different than pumping apparatus. Aerial apparatus is designed to get firefighters, water, and equipment to great heights. Prior to this, Anniston still had the same 1947 Seagrave ladder truck that had been struck when firefighter Walters had been killed. And of course, Chief Holland had been on the scene there. What was purchased was a snorkel. The bucket could be lifted some 75 feet in the air, put 1,000 gallons per minute of water on the fire. It had a high price tag. It was $88,000. It was loudly complained about at the time that they spent so much money. But after the fire that you see here, and all Anniston firemen dread a downtown fire because of how the fire could spread. But after the fire here, this was in 1974 at the smokehouse. The snorkel kept it from spreading. And the city manager the next day said it was well worth the money. It had vindicated itself. Later in the decade, that older ladder truck was replaced with a new 100-foot one. The 1970s saw not only equipment come to the fire department, but the first arson investigation team, the first emergency medical technicians. But it wasn't without some major fires as well, like the Virgil Coker fire on Noble Street. There were some heroics performed during that fire, as well as some firefighters that were injured. And I don't have time to go into detail, but it is in the book. The 1980s began with a monumental change. Fire Station 1, which had been department headquarters, located on Gurnee Avenue since the late 1880s, was replaced. The new Fire Station 1, located at 17th and Layton, offered more office space, more space for equipment, work areas, and quarters for firefighters. And we call these firehouses because firefighters live there 24 hours a day. It's still in use as department headquarters today. In February of 1982, Chief Holland made a decision that changed my life. He hired me as a rookie firefighter. I can't fathom how different my life would have been had he not done that. Shortly after, when I was in recruit school, another old station was torn down and replaced with a new one. This is the station at F Street in Wilmer, Station 2, that was built in the late 20s. This is the one that had the branch of the library in that second floor. Thus far, I've been able to share my research with you. But from this point, I was there, and I took part in a lot of things. For example, I vividly remember the day in 1985 when I was at the dispatch desk at Station 1 when a man in painter's clothes burst through the front door. He was excited. He was out of breath. He was pointing across the street to what we called then the Kirby House. And all he could say was, "Fire." And we had one. A workman had been trying to remove the paint of this old house, and it was a hard job to do. So what they were doing to try to get it off of there was using torches and actually burning it off. As you can see, it didn't work too well. Fortunately, it was saved, and now it's the Finial, which is a real nice place. As the decade was drawing to a close, a fire occurred again that all Anniston firemen dread, and that's a downtown fire. In February of 1987, a call came in of a fire in the 800 block of Noble Street. That block was built somewhere between 1905 and 1909. Some of the businesses that you might remember that were there were Dawn 5 and 10, Easterling Hardware, the Community Action Agency was there. Warnock Furniture Company was located on that block. Also, there was a barbershop, a taxi stand. The old Beavis Hotel was there. And the fire started in the second story of the old hotel, and it quickly spread. It looks to a lot of people like these are all one building, but these buildings have a common firewall. And of course, a firewall is meant to stop the spread of fire from one to the other. But unfortunately, in the 1960s, someone had actually breached the firewall, cut doorways in the firewalls. So if a fire started, it would quickly spread, and that's what happened in this case. Unfortunately, and fires like this is why you have aerial apparatus, like the snorkel or ladder truck, but unfortunately, the snorkel was in the garage and out of service. And shortly after this picture was taken, you see the firefighter that's on the ladder truck there with the nozzle, shortly after this picture was taken, the nozzle broke. And so both of our aerial apparatus were out of service. For several days, we were at the scene putting out hot spots. It's estimated that over 2.5 million gallons of water were put on that fire. The ATF was the lead investigating agency because the Community Action Agency was there and they received federal funds. They ruled the fire to be of human origin, but they stopped short of calling it an arson. A few years later, the Williamson Commerce Center was built on that block. That fire was actually the last fire for Chief Holland. He had reached his 60th birthday and shortly thereafter retired. Taking his place was Chief Donald Cobb. Cobb was a 25-year veteran of the department at the time. The problem with Chief Cobb was that he was 57 years old at the time of his appointment, so he could only stay chief for 3 years. When he retired in 1990, another 25-year veteran took the helm, Chief Louis Lefoy. A lot of advancements were made under Chief Lefoy. One of those was hiring the department's first secretary. He also hired the first female firefighter in the department's history. That was 28 years ago. She's still there, and she holds the rank of assistant chief today. In March of 1993, we had a weather event that we now refer to as the Blizzard of '93. All stations were closed except for number 1 station. Everybody worked out of headquarters. I don't have any pictures to show you of it because nobody was out taking pictures. We certainly didn't have time to take pictures. In fact, we were so busy at one time we stopped writing reports. At the time, I was a young lieutenant with a wife and a 5-year-old son. We lived in a small trailer. We were on a well. The power went out. We didn't have well water anymore with the pump out. So we had to melt water or melt snow for water. We did have a gas stove, but I couldn't get the vehicles out of the driveway because of the ice and the snow. So I got a call from the fire department. They said, listen, if we could come get you in a 4-wheel drive, could you come to work? And I said, yes, I could. My wife still doesn't understand that, but they picked several of us up in the vehicle, including my assistant chief. And on the way to the station, he looked at me and he said, Lieutenant Boyd, I've got one order for you to begin with. I said, yes, sir. And he said, when you get to the station, take a shower. And I said, yes, sir. I was happy to do that. I worked 36 hours straight. Most people work longer than that. Since the early 1990s, our area had lived with the threat of losing Fort McClellan. In 1999, it happened. It was a major blow to the area. Anniston firefighters and equipment moved into the old federal station out there on Fort McClellan itself. And of course now they've gone from there out on Highway 21 to the new Station 3 near Linlock. A change of command occurred in the early 2000s. Chief Leafoy retired, and Bill Fincher was chosen as the 8th man to lead the Anniston Fire Department. For several years, the United States government had been planning to destroy the aging stockpile of chemical weapons. 7.1% of those were located at Anniston Army Depot. One of Chief Fincher's first priorities was to make sure that the fire department had a hazardous materials response in case any of the chemical got off of the depot during the period of time that things were going to be incinerated. A lot of federal money came into the area to prepare both the citizens and first responders. The vast majority of Anniston firefighters were trained as hazardous material technicians. Some of us went a little further and were trained as hazardous material specialists. Also purchased was a command vehicle dedicated to hazardous materials. It was customly built for the Anniston Fire Department. The night of July 26, 2003 was a muggy night in Anniston. An alarm came in from the Am South Bank building at 931 Noble Street. The building was built in 1920. Now, a fire alarm there was not a rare occurrence. In fact, on this day, we had been there 3 times. Still, even though we responded a lot to alarms there, the fire department came from 3 different stations and converged on the block. Lieutenant David Sides, who was acting captain that shift, was just about to give the order for everybody to go back to their station when he happened to look up and he saw a glow in the 10th floor window. He notified headquarters. I was the captain then, and since our assistant chief was off, I was acting assistant chief. By the time I arrived, the windows had broken out. Flames were coming from the 10th floor and leaping up to the floor above. And I remember as I was driving down there watching that, how much it resembled a candle burning. When I got there, it dawned on me that I was the first Anniston firefighter in the history of the department to be in command of a high-rise fire. Less than 2 years earlier, we had seen the effects on fire on a high-rise when we saw the towers fall at the World Trade Center. That was heavy on our minds that night. The building wasn't equipped with sprinklers, but it did have a standpipe system. And so the procedure is to carry your hose, go up the stairwell to the floor below the fire, hook up to the standpipe system, and then use the stairway and go up and fight the fire. Well, the trouble was, at the command post that I was at on the street, I got a call that for whatever reason, the threads of our hose and the threads on the standpipe system wouldn't match up. So we had no choice except to take 3-inch supply hose and run them all the way from the street all the way up to the stairwell and fight the fire that way. I had thoughts of perhaps using the elevator to bring equipment up, but after the first trip, the elevator burned out, so we couldn't do that. It was a perfect storm. Just like it had been in 1987, the snorkel was in the garage, and it wasn't available, and the ladder truck was just a little bit short. And if that wasn't enough, as you can see from the picture, down toward the bottom, Noble Street was being resurfaced. So it was closed, and it was nothing except for a dirt road bed. And as you can see, that road bed was several feet below the sidewalk level. We were there for over 10 hours. 35 guys fought the fire. No one was hurt, and the building still stands. I've always thought that the motto of the fire service should be something like Semper Gumby, always flexible. We had to be flexible that night. In May of 2012, Chief Fincher decided that 31 years was long enough and retired. He became the first Anniston Fire Chief to retire without reaching the mandatory retirement age of 60. Replacing him was 27-year veteran Chief Tony Taylor. Chief Taylor is a second generation firefighter in Anniston. Out of the gate, Chief Taylor worked on public relations. He wanted citizens to see that firefighters just didn't sit around the station waiting on a call, that they were part of the community. He's also responsible for the training center that you see out now on Highway 21 and what used to be the old Marvin's building. It's there on the same property as the new Station 3. It's a regional training campus of the Alabama Fire College, and students have come there from literally all over the world. We've had a student there that came from South Korea. Chief Taylor remained at the helm until January 2007, and in March of that year, Chief Chris Collins was appointed chief, and he remains in that position today. 38 years ago, when I was offered the job of firefighter for the city of Anniston, I called my father and asked him what I should do. I mean, I had aspirations in other areas, and he urged me to take the job because he said it was a right job. And what he meant was that it was a job where one could make a difference. I have to admit that there were times over the years that I wondered about that. Puts me in mind of a story of a man that was walking along the beach one day all by himself. Out in the distance, he saw that there was a little girl. And this little girl, well, around her, she stood in the midst of a lot of starfish that had washed up on shore during the night. Certainly they were going to die. And he began to chuckle at the futility of her gesture, because what she was doing, she was taking these starfish and throwing them back in the water. And when he got up to her, he asked her, he said, "Little girl, do you think you're making any difference at all?" And she had the strangest look on her face. She looked up at him, she looked down at the starfish, she looked back up at him, then she looked at the starfish again, and she took one and threw it back in the water. And she said, "I made a difference to that one." Well, there have been many changes over the years, and not only the Anniston Fire Department, but in the fire service as well. I mean, it doesn't even look the same. But one thing that hasn't changed, and one thing that will never change about the Anniston Fire Department is you call them, and they'll come. And they'll do their job with loyalty, courage, and valor. Again, I'd like to thank the library for allowing me to come here, and I'd like to thank everybody that listened today.
Thank you so much. What a great and informative program. We hope that you enjoyed that. For those of you that are interested in the book, Loyalty, Courage, and Valor, you can purchase it on Amazon. I think it's also carried at Colletic Treasures in Jacksonville, in Anniston. I'm sorry, Colletic Treasures in Anniston. And he is also leaving some copies here at the library if you would like to come by and purchase a copy here at the library. Then if you have stayed tuned and you're interested in the secret code for the mission to get 500 points for the program today in the summer reading program, the word for today is Boyd, B-O-Y-D. So you can put that in as your secret code and you will immediately receive 500 points for the summer reading program. We thank you so much for tuning in. I hope that you'll watch some of the other programs that we have coming up, and stay tuned to our Facebook page. And remember that also the live programs are also aired on YouTube. It's YouTube/PubLibAnn, PUBLIBANN, and they are also available on our website. So if you have friends that you want to invite but they aren't on Facebook, remind them that they can also watch the programs the other way. Again, thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you back next time. Bye.